Good morning, Frank.
Good morning. How are you?
Yeah, I'm okay, thanks. How you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. It's been an interesting week.
Yeah, and we're gonna obviously talk about this. You are one of the barristers representing Hamas in its, I'm gonna say case, but it's not a case yet, in its appeal to the UK and to the Secretary of, I've lost it, Secretary of
State for the Home Department or the Home
State, yeah.
Secretary.
Yeah, yeah. So decision to designate the movement, the whole movement, and we're going to come back to this, as a terrorist or terror group or terrorist organization. To explain it, Hamas Qassam Brigade, so the armed wing of Hamas, was designated as a terror group in 2001. Oh,
Yep.
right?
Yep. Yep.
And then Priti Patel designated the whole movement, including its political wing, in 2021 as a terror group. So I was wondering, before we get into the case, sorry to call it a case, but you explain why it's not a case yet.
Well,
How?
in some ways
Yeah,
that was a bit rhetorical. It's like I was trying to make clear that look, it's not a legal case, but you can call it a case. It's all, I
yeah,
mean, there's lots of different ways of terminology that you can
yeah.
refer to it. Call it a case if you want. It's fine.
So yeah, could you? Because I know you've talked about this often already in the last few days, but could you remind us exactly of what this decision in 2021 was and who made it?
Absolutely. So the Secretary of State is the person who's empowered by the Terrorism Act 2000 to make such a decision, to add an organization to the list. And a predecessor back in 2001, in the heady days of Tony Blair's government, has, as you said, they added the military wing, right? That was, if you think about it, shortly after the Terrorism Act came into force, right? And then fast forward 20 years, the Home Secretary at the time, Priti Patel, added the political wing, right? And as I've said in some other contexts, what's so shocking about that and what's so unhelpful about that is that it shuts down any engagement really with Hamas, or it certainly has a massive sweeping negative sort of chilling effect on people's ability to engage with Hamas. And that's a problem because it's perhaps obvious to state that Palestine is seeing an awful lot of violence and has done for more than a century, right? So it's a really intractable conflict. And what we know from history is that intractable conflicts require difficult conversations with parties that profoundly disagree with each other. Now, the other thing we learn from history, riffing off of that, is that once an organization starts winning elections, you, there's no alternative to talking to them. And if you don't talk to them, you end up with this kind of genocidal logic we're seeing right now. And I went into this a bit with Jeremy Scahill yesterday, right? It becomes quite a genocidal logic. You end up saying, well, a majority of people or a large number of people in Gaza voted for Hamas, and so they're all guilty, and that's why we can massacre them in the way that we are. So it's an extremely problematic decision. It's we say in this application that, just to be a bit technical for a moment, it's our understanding that the Secretary of State adds an organization to the list, and then you make an application for that organization to be removed from the list. So some people might say, well, why don't you just apply for one wing, for the political wing to be removed? Well, it's a matter for the Secretary of State. If she wants to add two different organizations to the list, then such a avenue might be open to us. But as things stand, it's our understanding that she added the whole organization, so we're applying for the whole organization to be removed.
And the person in 2021 who decided to designate the whole of Hamas as a terror group it's very interesting to talk for a bit about this person, and why she may have done this. Could you just address this for just a minute?
Yeah, so two things then. Priti Patel herself and her lack of credibility, and then secondly, some of her reasoning, all right? It's worth mentioning that people who want to engage with this reasoning can read the pleadings in full. I, of course, drafted the pleadings with my colleague, Daniel Gruter, who's at the bar, and my instructing solicitor, Fahad Ansari. So the three of us, in dialogue with 20 experts, drafted that very extensively. So people interested in reading that, those documents, right, 600 pages odd of submissions and accompanying expert reports, they can go to hamascase.com, where all of those pleadings and documents have been made available. And even if they disagree with the application, at least they will be entering into the sort of difficult dialogue that's necessary to pursue peace. All right. So hamascase.com has all the pleadings. And then the 2 points, Priti Patel, I mean, in some ways, She's not a difficult politician to criticize. It's not difficult to undermine her credibility. If I may say, I mean, I don't want to get too personal, but her general interventions, her approaches to policy and so forth have been marked by a certain thoughtlessness. I think that she often gave the impression of not being really on top of her brief and being quite out of her depth. And she would just, if memory serves, she would sort of just show up to these press briefings with a very limited grasp of some of the very important subjects she was talking about. And the obvious point, I suppose, is that she lost her cabinet position at one point because of criticisms that she faced dealing with the apartheid state of Israel in an improper way, a way that was felt to be so improper that she was sacked. So she lacks that credibility. She's clearly a staunch ally of Israeli apartheid and its animating ideology of Zionism. And for that reason alone, the decision seems to be quite biased. Of course, it's a decision of the executive, not the judiciary. So allegations of bias aren't quite as, if a judge is accused of bias, it's quite a serious matter because judges have to appear to be impartial, whereas with the executive, they're allowed a bit more political latitude. But just as a matter of common sense, it's quite clear that she was extremely biased against Palestinians and in favor of the apartheid state that is racially dominating them and, ethnically cleansing them. So she's a compromised figure. She's the one who made the decision in 2021, this extraordinary decision to add not just the military wing, but the political wing. And then her reasoning, again, the reasoning is addressed extensively in the application itself, and I encourage people to read it. But some of the reasons she cited, one is to do with anti-Semitism. This is addressed extensively. You may have seen from a talk show segment that I did with someone who, as I put to him, was a bit out of his depth. He started quoting the Hamas charter at me, which is fine. But as I pointed out to him, that charter is from 1988, right? We think about that. Hamas was founded in 1987. So it's just after Hamas has been founded. And it's a kind of very rough and ready document that does clearly contain some things that it shouldn't have contained, as far as most ordinary people, certainly in Europe, are concerned, right? Of course, there is a broader context to why an organization finding itself in the Gaza Strip, finding itself being racially dominated by an ethno-state that calls itself the Jewish state, might fall into some of the traps that Zionism has set. That's not to make some simplistic intervention into the question of anti-Semitism and Hamas. It's just to say there's a context here that most Zionists and most supporters of Israel deliberately strip away, right? But the 1988 Charter has been widely criticized. That's almost 40 years old, right? What are we, 2025? It's coming up on 40 years old. And what's clear is that Hamas have issued far more up-to-date, far more mature exposition of their politics in the form of the 2017 Charter. And that's addressed extensively in the application. The 2017 Charter significantly undermines Priti Patel's claim that anti-Semitism provides a basis for adding someone to the list of prescribed organizations. And then the other thing that seems to have come up a lot is threats to people in Britain, or the United Kingdom, as it's sometimes called. Now, I think the proper framing here, as far as at least the right-wing press seems to be dealing with this, is the framing of atrocity propaganda, right? Atrocity propaganda, I don't have a definition to hand. I could probably Google it, but I know what atrocity propaganda is. I think we all do because we've seen it for 18 months. I mean, frankly, we've seen it for centuries, right? The playbook of atrocity propaganda is extremely well established. Atrocity propaganda is whenever an atrocity that either did or didn't happen, so it can be a made-up atrocity or it can be an actual atrocity, is used to justify far greater violence, right? And so what the right-wing press seem to be doing around this, and what a lot of Zionists are doing, is using the atrocities that happened on October 7th, right? A lot of things happened on October 7th. Some legitimate military targets were attacked. That's clear, right? Palestinians have a right to use armed force. Some legitimate military targets were attacked. Some of the atrocities were committed by the Israeli forces themselves, enacting their notorious Hannibal doctrine. But that's in no way supposed to diminish the fact that clearly crimes were committed. Some of the crimes seem to have been committed by members of the organization I represent, by Hamas members. And Hamas's position is articulated very, very clearly in this application. They say we have command and control, we have rules of engagement, we observe the laws of war, and we reserve the laws of Islamic jurisprudence. And when our members breach those laws, we are committed to holding them accountable because they say that they are a legitimate military organization fighting a national liberation struggle. So they say, insofar as atrocities were committed on that day, we want to be held accountable. And as I've said to other people in the press, it's clear that it's Israel who's not serious about accountability. They don't care about accountability at all. And Hamas has made it explicit they do.
Hey, sorry to cut you off just for a sec, but it's very important to mention that Hamas from the start have said that they were open to an independent investigation on October the 7th, right?
Exactly.
Israel has always refused an independent investigation on October 7th. And sorry to cut you off.
No, not at all. I'm talking quite a lot, and it's better for it to be dialogue, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. I think that to make the broader point, which is made in the application, like we take this broad historical approach as part of the factual background and part of the argumentation, right? Like, can't understand this without understanding that the history of the Zionist colonization of Palestine is more than 100 years old, right? And so I'm making a much broader point here, but you're basically saying Hamas is not afraid of an inquiry. Hamas says, right, fine, yes, let's have a full, proper investigation and let's see what actually happened, because they can see that whenever you shed light on the facts of what's actually happening in Palestine, Zionist credibility starts to crumble. It's Zionism, and this is a point we make in the application, Zionism has always been premised on the most staggering lies about Palestinians and about what's actually happening, right? Not least the central lie, the central sort of, you talk about this biblical metaphor of the building your house on the sand or building it on the rocks. Zionism is built on sand. It's built on the malicious falsehood that Palestinians don't exist, or that they somehow don't exist as a civilized people because they're not European enough to justify being recognized as fully human. So Zionism has always been premised on the most racist lies, and it's predictable then that that when it comes to something like October 7th, what we have on the anti-Zionist side, and what my client says, is we're committed to the truth. We do not shy away from accountability. We take the laws of war seriously, and we take holding our own members accountable for things they've said and done seriously. That includes anti-Semitism, and it includes allegations of atrocities and war crimes and all the rest of it. It's Israel that has no interest in that light being shone on their activities, because it's, as I've said, as soon as you start shining light on Zionism and on the state of Israel and its actions, its credibility just crumbles. And just to quickly wrap up the point that I was coming to, and perhaps I was being too long-winded, the other part of the Secretary of State's reasoning, Priti Patel, was to do with, another part of it was to do with this threat to Britain. I mean, I've addressed this extensively with Jeremy, but I'll reiterate here. It's a nonsense point. It's completely nonsensical. Hamas has never attacked people in Britain. It has never indicated a desire to. Its strategy is very clearly articulated, and they are explicit that they are a national liberation struggle concerned with Palestine. Clearly, there are broader dynamics at work. Clearly, Britain does support Zionism, so does the US, and the support for Israel is staunch. But the movement that I represent, Hamas, they have said they have no interest in territorial operations beyond Palestine. And so what the right-wing press seems to be doing is saying, look, some British people were killed, sometimes in atrocious ways. And so they're trying to take the British people back to that day, 7th of October 2023, which is 18 months ago, take them back to that day and stoke people's feelings, make them feel very, very angry about the often horrific ways in which people died on that day, in order to justify the horrific ways in which Palestinians are dying as you and I are speaking, and not just dying, because that's passive. They're being murdered by an apartheid regime that the British government supports to the hilt. And so it's perhaps unsurprising that the obsequious stenographers in the British media are trying to run cover for their own government while they commit mass murder. But a light is being shone more and more on the sheer scale of the depravity and the racism for which not only the Israeli government, but the British government is responsible. And so to put it concisely, Priti Patel's suggestion that Hamas poses a threat to Britain is nonsense. The obvious fact is that Britain poses an existential threat to the people of Palestine because it stands accused of committing a genocide against them. And obviously, we must never stop talking about that video that the Prime Minister appeared on when he was leader of the opposition. He stands accused of committing a war crime in that video, right? Aiding and abetting a genocide. That's the allegation against him. I hope that video indelibly marks that man's character for the rest of his life, because it seems unlikely, if Tony Blair's example is anything to go by, that he'll ever face any personal criminal consequences. I hope I'm wrong about that, but we can at least hold him accountability in the so-called court of a public opinion, and he must be remembered forever. He will be remembered forever as a man who gave an apartheid state a carte blanche to commit genocide when that genocide had already started.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And I think that's why, like everything you just talked about, and the most well-known myth of Israel is a land for people without a land. Yeah, I think I got this wrong as well. But anyway, people know.
No, you got it right.
I'm really tired. But anyway,
but aren't we all, man? People, it's a land without the people for a people without
exactly.
land.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, what I wanted to say is that, and you've addressed this in the mainstream media as well, by focusing on Hamas, by focusing on they're saying defending Hamas, which is not what you're doing. You're defending Hamas the right to appeal a decision under British law. The framework moves away from the genocidal state of Israel and puts all the blame on the occupied and on the colonized, right? Talking about Hamas's charter of 1988, which contain a lot of things that are wrong, puts the blame away from the occupier. I mean, Hamas was created in 87. Israel was created in 48. The Balfour Declaration was in 1917. So it's such an sort of colonized and Orientalist and Euro-centered point of view, right, that shifts the blame away from the aggressor and puts the blame on the victim. And since when an occupied people should have the moral high ground, should do, and in a way, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but I was, when I went to Palestine a few times, I always met these really young, bright European folks working for the UN. And we would have dinners and stuff, and they would go, I support Palestine, but come on, I mean, the right, the armed resistance that they often choose, I really condemn that. I'm so opposed to it. And I'm like, look, as a moral principle, yes. But have you been enslaved and in cage for 17 years? Have you seen your dad, your mother, your kid, your house destroyed, 20 times? It's so easy to have the moral high ground when we're sitting here in our comfy apartments in London or in Brussels, etc., right?
Yeah, I think what you're basically talking about strategy, right? And I think that it is one thing. I mean, I've been to Palestine a few times, and I went, I worked at an NGO there, and I have a lot of friends there. My Arabic teacher is based in Gaza. She's had to flee to Egypt, of course. Horrific, her and her sister. And it's one thing to engage with Palestinians as an equal and to say, well, look, I'm some Irish guy, some white guy who lives in London, and I'm not going through what you're going through, but I care about the staggering affront to your dignity that you're being expected to endure. And so as one human to another, let's enter into this dialogue about what is to be done about achieving some kind of peaceful solution where Palestinian humanity and dignity can emerge from underneath the apartheid regime that is, racially dominating Palestinians. But that sort of sincere dialogue of equals about strategy, right? What's the correct strategy? Some people talk about Gandhi and they say pacifism is the correct strategy. MLK, right? Martin Luther King, who was, of course, extremely militant and has been whitewashed considerably by liberal historians who want to take his, defang him and take out his teeth retrospectively, when at the time he was considered a dangerous subversive, right? And, there's that notion that a liberal likes to look to the past and to other countries for their supposedly radical, support for radical programs. But when those programs are actually, biting them on the nose or whatever, when they're happening in real time, that's when a lot of people, I don't know whether all liberals into the same category. Some liberals are supportive of Palestine, but broadly, when it comes to a strategic discussion, it's one thing to show up and say, well, I question whether armed struggle is a valid strategy in this case. That's one thing. It might be thought that it's for the Palestinian people to determine how they choose to liberate themselves. And it's our function as people not currently being racially dominated by Israel's apartheid regime to show solidarity to Palestinians in that struggle. That's different from morally judging someone from using armed force. And this is something we address in the application, right? Like, people have a right under international law to use armed struggle, armed force, to resist illegal occupation. There's no basis for doubting that it's illegal. We've known that since 2004 ICJ Wall opinion, and it's been reiterated in the 2024 ICJ's advisory opinion. So Palestinians are occupied. They're allowed to fight their occupiers. So people may disagree strategically and enter into a dialogue with Palestinians about that, but it's not their place to lecture Palestinians on whether or not to use armed struggle, because there are so many historical examples of colonized peoples, Algeria, you think about Vietnam as well, and the US, French and US interventions there, the north of Ireland, the south of Ireland. There are so many examples of struggles that have chosen armed struggle and have succeeded in ejecting a colonizer. So fine, you can have a strategic dialogue, but what you can't do is misstate international law and then start moralizing at Palestinians, because some of them, including my client, have chosen a strategy that revolves around, or at least includes, armed struggle.
Yeah, I was wondering, going back to this terror designation, and going back to this very Euro-centered vision of the world. Following October 7th, anyone who stood in solidarity with the Palestinian people and had access to the mainstream media, was invited to the mainstream media, had to answer this first question: do you condemn Hamas as a terrorist organization, right? But do you know, I was wondering, how many countries in the world have actually put Hamas on their terror list? Do you have an idea? Or
yeah, it's mentioned somewhere in the report. I don't have the figure in front of me, but it's a minority of countries that have prescribed them. Like most countries, you go to South Africa, you go to Qatar. There's loads of countries that haven't prescribed them, that say, right, well, they need to have quasi embassies and stuff. It's predictably, it's NATO countries. It's what you'd expect. It's staunch allies of Israeli apartheid who have prescribed them. But outside of that Western world, that's not the approach at all.
And I was wondering also, going back to the legal submission, Hamas in its submission said that the proscription hindered the group's ability to broker a political solution to the conflict. And I think that's a crucial part, right? Because, and it's very hypocritical as well, right? Because we know that people say Hamas is a terror organization and you don't talk to terrorists. But in practice, they talk to terrorists. We use all the time. We know Hamas is trying to broker another ceasefire now with Israel. They're talking to one another. So how important is, how problematic is this proscription when it comes to brokering whatever it's peace in the Middle East?
That's the crucial point, I think. And I don't want to make, I'm trying really hard not to make this story about me, despite the right-wing press's attempts to do so, right? But, I come from the north of Ireland, and there is peace in the north of Ireland. I'm not saying that everything has been resolved. There are, what are sometimes called legacy issues. There are crimes that were never properly solved, and, even just properly witnessed. People's suffering hasn't always been witnessed. But broadly speaking, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 is quite a hopeful example of a very bloody, intractable conflict that created provision for what Irish Republicans were asking for. Irish Republicans said, we want a united Ireland, and we don't see how we can do that without armed struggle. And 1998 was the process by which an agreement was reached that says, and we can interrogate that agreement to an extent, but broadly what's clear is there's provision for a plebiscite to be held if, as I understand it, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, so-called, gets to decide when the time is right to hold such a plebiscite. And if the people of the north and the south of that island vote for it, they'll be the United Ireland that Irish Republicans were trying to achieve by armed force. And so that's extremely hopeful. I grew up with violence. I grew up with bombs being planted in, the town where I went to school was blown up by a real IRA bomb. The people from the north of Ireland have extremely high instances of PTSD. So again, I'm not making a crass comparison. It's not the same as what's going on in Palestine, because the way in which Palestinian life has been devalued is one of the most staggering things I've ever seen. Like, you have literal defense minister of an apartheid regime calling them human animals. It's just astonishing. And I think that, since then, people have compiled archives of genocidal rhetoric by the most senior Israeli politicians. This is a fascist state, right? That's not rhetoric. I talked previously in the press about Bezalel Smotrich. He says he's a fascist, but we've all seen the images, like people carving a Star of David into Palestinians' bodies. Like, that's fascism. There's no other word for it. And so, some would say that some of the loyalists in the north of Ireland were also fascist. We can have a discussion about that. But the point is, Israeli apartheid needs to be dismantled, and we need to achieve peace. And the way you achieve peace is by having difficult conversations that you don't agree with, people you don't agree with. And if the Secretary of State is going to prescribe the organizations that some Palestinians have voted for, it's going to make those difficult conversations basically impossible. So it's a clear obstacle to peace, and it's an obstacle to peace, and it needs to come to an end.
Yeah, and I mean,
it needs to come to an end.
I want to say something about where you mentioned apartheid needed to be dismantled. It's not Franck Magennis saying that, right? It's like the ICJ in 2021 that says 2024, sorry, that said in kind of a historical decision, even before we're sitting down, we go to the stage of negotiation. The first step is the Israeli occupation, the Israeli apartheid system has to be dismantled. So exactly. This is the first step. It's not, again, you saying it, it's not radical, anarchists saying it, even though they say obviously as well, it's about the ICJ decision. I want to ask you something briefly about the impact of this decision, because also when Priti Patel mentioned, gave this decision in 2021, she said that, and I want to quote, people expressing support, and support is very vague, for the movement being Hamas, are facing up to 10 years in prison. So I want to ask you about the importance of this case in regards to all of us, people defending Palestine and Palestinian, right to self-determination, because I also know that obviously you're working to defend these people that have been criminalized over the last decades, but mostly over the last year and a half.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's really helpful. I'm glad you raised it, Frank. I would say that this application has given people space to talk about something that a lot of people want to talk about, and they have been self-censoring, and that's the key Article 10 human rights argument we're making, right? The free speech argument is that even people who are extremely critical of Hamas, but who want to talk about the fact that people in Palestine are facing a genocide, and that the fact that some people voted for Hamas is being used as an explicit justification for massacring Palestinian children because they're deemed a racial threat, right? This is just a staggering affront to humanity. It's really difficult to overstate how disgusting that is and how alarming that is, right? And how unlawful it is, right? And so, I just think, well, the application is trying to make the point that it's providing a lot of materials basically, and it's giving space for people to talk about something they wouldn't otherwise, because it's making, especially as the fact that we're lawyers, we're saying, look, there are lines here, there are criminal offences which remain on the books, notwithstanding the fact that we've made this application. But you can absolutely talk about this, and indeed, some people would say that if you want a peaceful solution, you urgently need to talk about it. And so I suppose part of the hope is that when people do find themselves facing some often extremely malicious prosecutions, I would say, right, just hyper-scrutinization of pro-Palestinian speech. We know that the Metropolitan Police has that weird little situation room where they're spying on these massive marches through London and other cities, and hyper-scrutinizing the placards and trying to find any excuse. Someone wears a sign that has some Arabic in it, and that's deemed inherently suspicious. Just openly racist stuff, right? So hyper-scrutinization of pro-Palestinian speech with a view to bringing prosecutions under this very legislation. And it's to be hoped that when people who are clearly innocent, who've just intervened in the discourse in one way or another, but in a way that isn't even criminal on the terms of the British state's own racist laws, that this application will provide them with a lot of materials. There's nothing to stop people charged with criminal offences from reading the application and advancing some of the arguments in other legal contexts, right? And it's 100-page legal submissions that talk extensively about some of the legal framework governing the broader conflict. And it's to be hoped that this pushes back against the speech. Again, to state the obvious, Keir Starmer can say things that seem on their face certainly he's been met with the allegation that he's committed a war crime on camera, right? That's not hyperbole. The allegation is that he aided and abetted a genocide on camera. He doesn't face any criminal consequences. These politicians can openly express support for a genocidal regime while it's committing genocide, it can send them, the British state can send bombs to a country that stands accused by Ireland even, right? Britain's oldest colony is saying this is genocide. Like, we agree with South Africa, but Britain can send bombs, face no legal consequences. But someone shows up to a march because they're horrified by a genocide and they hold up a placard. The British state is going to come down like a ton of bricks on such people. It's an outrageous disparity of power. It's exactly what we would expect from the British Empire that spent hundreds of years doing this sort of thing. But hopefully by this application, we have pushed back against the disgraceful conduct of the British government in all of this.
Hey, I don't want to keep you for too long, but I've got two more questions. Could you briefly say what are the next steps into the application process? And also, could you address the response of the mainstream media or the corporate media that has focused extensively on yourself, that has kind of framed you as a terrorist sympathizer? But as a counter example, there's a British barrister, very prominent, called Malcolm Shaw, that I'm sure you know of, who has defended Israel at the ICJ, right, in regards to the case of South Africa. And he hasn't been accused of being a genocide enabler or apartheid supporter, even though it's been clearly, the research on Israeli apartheid is now massive, right? So can you just quickly address what are the next steps of the application and this sort of, again, very racist framework of the British mainstream media when it comes to Palestine or Israel?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, the first question again, I didn't take a note of it. It was,
the next steps.
Next steps, and then responsibility. Yes, of course. So the next steps, the application was submitted on Wednesday, and the Secretary of State for the Home Department, Yvette Cooper, has 90 days to respond to it. When she responds to it, she will either agree with our application, which has happened in the past. Various organizations have been removed from the list following applications such as this. So if she chooses to remove it, then that's that. But if she makes a decision refusing to remove it, then she will set out reasons for that decision, and that decision letter then becomes the object, the target of a challenge. If Hamas decides to challenge that decision, they have a statutory right of appeal to a judicial body called the Prescribed Organisation Appeals Commission, which is basically kind of like the High Court but with more judges, right? So quite a senior court with 3 judges. Technically, I think it's a tribunal, and that court or that commission has the power to interrogate the decision, and if they will be empowered with so-called public law principles, which is a bit of a technical term but the lawyers will be familiar with what I'm talking about. And whatever they decide, whether they decide to overturn the decision or to uphold it, either party to the proceedings will have the usual right of appeal to Court of Appeal, UK Supreme Court, and thereafter the European Court of Human Rights. And then as to this question of the right-wing media, it's as I said, I mean, they're not real journalists, most of these people. I think there are a few exceptions. There are a few right-wing journalists who disagree, but will actually do their job and say, right, well, I disagree with you, but let's explore this. But a lot of what's happening, certainly on these talk radio shows and so on, they're just throwing slogans at you and talking across you. Like, you've not talked across me, right? You can disagree with someone without talking across them. And there was that chap on Talk TV who just kept talking across me, and I tried to sort of say, like, this is shocking to me. Like, I come from a place where we argue for a living. We have really, really serious arguments where we often disagree quite intensely, but it's considered necessary if you're going to have a difficult discussion with someone to have some rules of the game so you can actually hear what the other person is saying. So, I mean, if nothing else, I would say the lack of intellectual seriousness by some parts of the media is embarrassing. I'm not trying to be nasty. I'm genuinely embarrassed for them. I think those people should be embarrassed to call themselves journalists, because it's just not real journalism what they're doing, and I don't think they think that it is, and it must cause some damage to their self-esteem, and they have to go home at night and look in the mirror and be like, I pretend to be a journalist, but really I just shout at people and talk over them because I'm afraid of what they have to say. So that's genuinely quite pathetic. But I mean, it's what you'd expect. But in any event, as long as people are talking about this important application, I suppose that's the rationale for going on to these shows, is to go and say, like, well, you're not going to really give me a fair hearing, but I'm going to try and reframe things. And that's what I've tried to do. That I think what the mistake that a lot of people make when engaging with these bad faith so-called journalists is that they accept their framing. And what I've attempted to do, I did it on LBC a couple of days ago. The guy, Tom somebody, Tom Swarbrick, I think his name is, he said something about a British woman who was killed. And I sort of, before he had a chance to frame things in that way, my attempt was to say, like, look, there's a genocide happening and Palestinian dignity and humanity is being denied. So whatever else we might discuss, whatever disagreements we might have, can we proceed on the basis of Palestinian dignity? So you have to attempt to just run a bulldozer through their framing, basically, and just say, your framing is disgraceful. Like, do not frame this in terms that justify an ongoing genocide. It's fine for you to ask me difficult questions, but make sure that you insulate the clips, the kind of recordings that are going to be made. Make sure you insulate this intervention, this dialogue we're having, from instrumentalization by an apartheid regime while it commits a genocide. But the problem is that these right-wing hacks are apologists for that genocide. They deny that it's a genocide. They're apologists for Israeli apartheid. They're apologists for colonialism. And so they're not interested in having that discussion with me, because I suppose if they did, they might behave in a less disgusting and racist way. So there's no love lost between us. I doubt I'm going to change their mind. But if some right-wing journalists are watching this, why don't you have some courage? Like, why don't you do the difficult thing and say, you know what, I am making myself complicit in a genocide, and that's doing moral damage to me, and I'm going to stop, and I'm going to take the difficult step to speak up against my employer, to admit publicly that, yeah, this is what we've been doing. We've been doing atrocity propaganda, and apologize, not to me, apologize to the Palestinian people, that so many of these so-called journalists, at a time when Palestinian journalists are being massacred. I was speaking to Jeremy about this. It's like this, underreported in the Western media, completely underreported, how many of their colleagues have been massacred deliberately because they are journalists, and they're, as I said, casting light on the lies on which Zionism has always been based. So, like I said, I think we're drawing to a close now, but I just want to conclude by addressing the Palestinian people. I'm sorry that I'm devastated that you have had to endure 18 months of genocide as part of more than a century of racist colonization. I am doing what I can as a lawyer and as a human to show solidarity with you. And even though the craven apologists for apartheid and colonialism in governments like the British speaks for itself, you should know that the people of the world are on your side.
Hey, Frank, thanks a million. This was a beautiful end, but I've got a last point I want to address, because I think this is what this application might open up as well, this debate. I think that's probably for a show itself, but the use itself of the word terrorism, we're not talking about that, right? Even the left talk about there's terrorist, there's non-terrorist, but terrorism is a very disputed term, right? And there's actually no definition of terrorism, not agreed. The CIA's got one, the UN's got one. So, I'll show you when I was preparing this interview, I was reading this book by Iqbal Ahmad called Terrorism, Theirs and Ours. And could you, because I know you've got to run, but briefly address the way terrorism has been used mostly by the West to make sure occupied people don't have the right to self-defense in a way?
Yeah, of course. We talk about this in the application. There's a section on terminology, and we note that the term terrorism emerged, of course, in the French Revolution, right? And it's an extremely political term. There are attempts to define it legally, but those attempts are pretty ridiculous, right? The definition of terrorism in the Terrorism Act is a ridiculous definition. It's like, and what it creates is a discretion for the Secretary of State to basically say, we don't like this group, so we've made it illegal to be a member and to even talk about them in certain ways. And so, it's as I've said repeatedly in the media, the discretion is so broad that it basically captures any military of any country and any armed group. So she could prescribe the IDF as she wants to, pursuant to this incredibly broad definition. If people want to read it, they can go on, legislation.gov.uk, just read the Terrorism Act. If nothing else, I would encourage people, and especially my detractors, to go and read Section 4 of the Terrorism Act. Just go and read that section and tell me why you're so bothered by the fact that a lawyer made an application under Section 4. Just literally go and read it. But as to the definition is also contained in that act. I can get it up now, thanks to our friends at Google. And you'll see that Section 1 of that act says terrorism interpretation. Right? So Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2000 predictably opens up with a definition of terrorism. Go and take a look at that definition, people who are interested in educating yourselves about this, and just see how broad it is, right? Involves serious violence against a person, involves serious damage to property. Okay, so anyone who's picking up a gun and shooting people, clearly that is going to be caught by that sort of definition. And it's about, well, I'm not going to start reading out the entire provision, but broadly it's about, Section 1C, the use or threat is used, is made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. I mean, that's the IDF. The IDF is involving serious violence against a person. There's no basis for doubting that. And they're doing it to advance a political ideology called Zionism, which views Palestinians as a racial threat. So by the Secretary of State's, or by Tony Blair's legislation's definition, they're terrorists. But the Secretary of State has such a broad discretion that she's chosen to inhibit our ability to talk about the people facing the genocide and not the people enacting it. And that's because, really, if you think about it, it applies to the British Army. This right-wing guy put this to me, and I sort of tried to give him a diplomatic answer. But the obvious answer is that, it's a slightly rhetorical point, because as a matter of law, it's actually quite confusing. But I asked this on Twitter rhetorically: is a genocide terrorism? Is a genocide caught by the definition of terrorism in the Terrorism Act? And the answer is yes. It is, obviously, because the definition is so broad. Of course, it's caught by it. So why is it that the British government doesn't want to admit that the IDF is engaging in genocide, which clearly meets the definition of terrorism in its own Terrorism Act 2000? The answer might be thought to come back, well, if they admitted that, they'd have to admit that they are engaged in terrorizing the Palestinian people in this genocide. And there's no reason to believe that the British Empire has enough self-awareness to actually acknowledge the extent to which they're engaged in the racist mass murder of Palestinians, because they're not Jewish.
Thanks, Frank.
Merci.
Thanks a bunch. Good luck with everything. And again, thank you.
Okay, très bien. À bientôt.
Ciao.